Hello and welcome to the as yet untitled Deadly Class podcast, where survival is extra credit. And both the title and the slogan will get better with time, I promise. I'm one of your hosts, Russ Burlingame, and with me tonight is one of your other hosts, Nicole Drum.
Hello.
We both write for comicbook.com, and so we have seen the pilot already a couple of times, actually, because it just got officially released on the Sci-Fi website tonight as we're recording this. It'll be last night by the time you hear it. But this is going to be our non-spoiler. It's not going to be too deep a dive, but we're going to talk about our kind of first impressions of the pilots and what we hope for the show. And then next time we're going to include at least one and possibly two more co-hosts, and we'll be talking a lot more in depth. The thrust of this show, as if you couldn't have guessed by clicking through it, is we're going to be talking about not only the Deadly Class television show that's coming to Sci-Fi in January of 2019, but also the comic book by Rick Remender, who's the showrunner on the TV show, artist Wes Craig, letterer Russ Wooten, and colorist Lee Loughridge. We're going to essentially do one episode each on issues of the comic and episodes of the show, and do a kind of deep dive. If you've ever heard From Crisis to Crisis, the podcast that Michael Bailey and Jeff, I've just totally blanked on Jeff's last name. Sorry, Jeff. But Michael Bailey and Jeff do about the 1986 to 2005 Superman books, where they do a very deep dive into each one, looking at, art and themes and all that kind of crap. That's kind of what we want to do with Deadly Class, which is kind of under-examined. I mean, there's a lot of writing about it in comics circles, but the first thing I did when I got the idea to do this podcast was kind of look and make sure that nobody was already doing a fan podcast. And for a comic this popular, from a writer as popular as Rick, I was kind of surprised that I was the first one doing it, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think that while it is definitely a very popular comic, I mean, I've read comics my whole life. I've heard of it. But I think for being a well-known comic from a very popular writer, to an extent, I think for some people there maybe has a bit of a niche feel to it. Because I'm going to be completely honest, I had never actually read the comics until the show kind of started being talked about. And I decided, like, you know what, let's check this out. And man, I had been missing out.
Yeah, it's a great book, and I had been intermittent essentially on the book. When Deadly Class first got announced, I'm pretty sure it was during that Image Expo where Rick had like 5 titles that got announced or some crazy thing. It was like Low and this one and the Mythology one and like all this crazy stuff, and it was just like, holy crap, he's just setting up a house over here. And all of the books sounded pretty good, and they've all been kind of to varying degrees really enjoyable books, and they've all had longevity to varying degrees depending on the schedules of Rick and the artist. But Deadly Class definitely has been the one that kind of broke out the biggest, because even before the TV show, it was the one that people talked about a lot. I think while I love the art on some of Remender's other Image Comics books, I do think that Wes Craig's very kind of visceral blend of a like late 90s Vertigo aesthetic with animation influences and stuff like that, it makes for a really unique look to the comic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what helped it to kind of break out of the pack.
Absolutely, and I think that you're dead on with your description of that too. As a long-time interested, first-time reader type of situation here, one of the very first things that I was really struck at as I kind of flipped through it was how it had this very cinematic, but also very gritty, kind of almost noir-like, but not really look to
Mm-hmm.
it. That was completely different than anything I've ever really seen, and I read a lot of comics.
Yeah, and it's funny because the first issue and also the first 15 minutes or so of the pilot really kind of reminded me of the first issue of The Invisibles. Did you ever read that with the Grant Morrison book?
Yes, I did read that.
And to be honest, there are elements of Jack Frost that you can see in Marcus throughout the comic, and I think we're going to see that reflected in the TV series, where Marcus is maybe not your traditional hero archetype. A lot of the time, Jack Frost was really only the protagonist because he was the nominal protagonist. You kind of wanted to slap him, and so I always feel like it's a little ballsy to do that with your protagonist because it shows a confidence in your supporting cast that that a lot of writers don't necessarily have, because I think a lot of writers get really precious about their lead.
Well, I also think it also kind of, in a sense, tells a better story because there's a lot of, even outside of the world of comics, there's a lot of structure in storytelling where you've got your protagonist, your hero character, and there are little boxes that you check off. I know in a previous life when I was teaching creative writing, one of the things that we taught was like, this is your hero, this is your protagonist, these are the things, the slots you have to fill to tell a story. And by basically picking, like you said, a character that kind of slap, as your protagonist, not only is it a confidence that you've got this supporting cast around it, you're telling a story that in a very real way is going to be a lot more identifiable for your reader, or in this case, your audience on the show as well.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get more investment because here's this character who's flawed, who annoys you, who maybe makes you mad, and before you know it, you're hooked in. And that's, admittedly, that's probably what really sucked me into reading the comics for Deadly Class.
Mm-hmm.
I intended to read like one issue at a time, take my time, and I was so both. I had this really strange reaction to Marcus, or very, very immediately, both this weird mix of sad and pity, and also I just want to choke this kid out. That made me want to keep reading because I kept getting invested more than I would have if it were a more of a traditional hero or protagonist character.
Yeah, and also one of the things you see, and like without spoiling anything, it certainly bears out in the comics, and I think you see it in the Invisibles too, is that when you start with a character who is so frustrating, it gives you a lot of places to go with their character arc,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows you to really build to a place where people are invested in the character because you've seen where they've gone over a course of time.
Absolutely. It sets up for a lot of character growth and in some cases regression.
Mm-hmm.
It in and of itself is a form of character growth and development.
So let's jump into the pilot a little bit because obviously we're gonna end up talking about all of this over again when we have our co-hosts with us. But if you want to read kind of an in-depth review that I did, which is also pretty non-spoilery, you can head over to comicbook.com, and I did a review there. Both of the executive producers, Rick Remender and Miles Feldscott Orion, or I can never remember. He's got a very long name. But both Rick and Miles have retweeted the review, so you could probably find it more easily there than you can at Comic Book almost, because Comic Book updates so often. Mm-hmm. But I said it's one of the best comic book pilots I've ever seen. I don't think that inherently means, holy crap, guys, this is going to be the best comic book show of all time. Because, you know, a lot of really good shows had not so great pilots, you know. And then you get a lot of shows that have a terrific pilot and kind of even out and become kind of middle of the road over time. I think like Lois and Clark is a great example of that. Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman had a pilot that I would say is on par with the best Superman feature films in terms of like a standalone story that introduces you to Lois and Clark and all that kind of stuff. But by about halfway through the third season, you were just like, make it end.
Yeah, I was going to say that particular pilot started off great and then took you on a slow train to Nopeville.
Yeah.
But, you know.
But yeah, so I think this is a terrific pilot. I think Lee Toland Krieger, who directed it, is one of these guys who is going to become a go-to name for pilots. You know, you have certain directors who, when you have a lot of money invested in the pilot, you have a lot of blah blah blah, you need the pilot to hit. There are certain directors that you turn to and you're like, okay, this guy's going to nail it. You know, Glenn Winter is one of those guys. And I think Lee Toland Krieger has become that very quickly. He's the guy who directed the Riverdale pilot. As a result of Riverdale, he got the Sabrina pilot. He did this one. He also did a show last year for the CW called Life Sentence, which was not a great show, but it visually was a really kind of cool, interesting show. And I think that palette was probably set by Krieger in the same way that he set kind of the cinematic language of Riverdale and Deadly Class going into it.
And one of the things I want to point out, as you're mentioning these other really truly fantastic pilots that he's done, because all the ones you named were good. Even Light Sentence, which again wasn't the best show, but it was really beautifully done in that pilot.
Hmm.
Um, they none of them look alike.
Yeah.
Like most of the times when you've got a director, you're going to see kind of their fingerprints in places on it. And while I was watching Deadly Class, I kind of had in the back of my head, these are some other things that he has done. But it was completely unique in its own.
Yeah.
It was incredible, especially for such a identifiable story.
Yeah.
Just huge credit to this pilot.
It's funny. I think if there was anything that I could kind of point to and be like, "Oh, that's Leto and Krieger," it's the use of reds. But and that's just because red is so prevalent in Riverdale. However, it's also incredibly prevalent in Deadly Class, the comic book.
Yeah.
And so it's almost kind of like, is that really him, or is that just that he was tapped to adapt something that, kind of speaks to something he's already done?
Well, I think it's also just a use of the shows that you mentioned all kind of have, for lack of a better term, sort of a bloody element to them.
Yeah.
And what else are you going to use the red?
Hmm.
So I think that's probably almost like an accidental signature. Because if you think about Light Sentence, there wasn't a whole lot of red in that pilot.
No, it was a lot of yellows and a lot of kind of melons.
Very, very birds and happiness.
Yeah.
Deadly Class is not it. Nope.
No.
But it is beautiful.
Yeah. And again, it's. I haven't really dug into. There's a few more screeners on the press site. And I haven't really dug into them yet to see kind of what we're looking at, but I am excited to see kind of what carries through. Once you get the next set of directors in, obviously with TV, you set up a lot of things in the pilot, and then the producers are the ones who carry it through, and directors are essentially guns for hire.
Right.
So when you have somebody who's a really kind of pervasive director, it's interesting to kind of look at that and go, okay, so what did he leave behind for the next people to work with? I do think Krieger, as he was on Sabrina, is a producer on this show. And so probably he was involved with more than just the pilot. He was probably involved with setting up a lot of stuff so that the look stays consistent.
And I think one of the things I really noticed in the pilot, the well-crafted use of music.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that even if there are visual changes as you go director to director, my hope is that heartbeat of music will continue and kind of create connective tissue.
Yeah.
Very real extent in the comics, each issue also kind of has a slightly different look.
Yeah.
So, but there's still that undercurrent. So I'm kind of hopeful that even with different directors, we're going to continue to have that fantastic music undercurrent, because it really does help carry the story without actually interfering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how the show evolves from here, kind of sonically. I think that one of the things when you look at the pilot, there's a lot of music in there. It's like, wow, we spent a lot of money clearing music, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of shows, I think that you would cut back on that after the pilot. I kind of feel like Deadly Class won't, in part because when we did the set visit and I was talking to members of the cast and all this kind of stuff, they talked about how Rick Remender had created playlists for them and given them each playlist that were specific to their character and specific to the era, because obviously it's set in the late 80s in kind of the punk underground scene in the West Coast. And the fact that he was kind of inundating the actors with that and helping, like, using that to shape their take,
Mm-hmm.
tells me that that's something that's going to be important to them going forward. When I got a press kit a couple of weeks ago, they actually included a Bluetooth speaker with it and a SKU code, or whatever you call those things, a QR code, so that you could kind of click into a Spotify playlist that was the soundtrack essentially to the pilot, plus one or two extra things.
Yeah, that definitely does seem to indicate that they're going to keep that going, which I think really will help. Not that the pilot didn't do an excellent job of setting the scene visually; it absolutely did.
Mm-hmm.
I'm old enough to remember 1987.
Yeah.
And what it looked like, sounded like, felt like, and
Yeah.
I very much was like, "Oh my God, my childhood!" A couple of times, which was a little unnerving, but in a good way.
Yeah.
I definitely think that there are elements here and there that kind of pull you up just a little bit, just by nature of it's not actually 1987, and
Yeah.
it will continue to keep you rooted in that time and also help you better understand some of the characters. I know specifically, um, it really helped me kind of lock into Billy a little bit,
Yeah.
just because punk rock sound, his look
Hmm.
really just drove it home for me a lot more clearly than it did in print.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say too, Liam James, first of all, he's great in this. Secondly, I had this great story. We went out to dinner with the cast and crew when we did the set visit. Liam sat across from me at the table and we got along really well. We talked about music and podcasts and all this kind of crap. And at the end of the night, I had told him I was going to bring him the first trade for Transmetropolitan because he wasn't a big comic book reader prior to taking the job.
Mm-hmm.
And I got back to my hotel room and I'm like, okay, I got to write myself a note, get him this comic at New York Comic Con. Liam, what was his name? Liam James? No, that's the guy from Psych. Oh. I had completely not connected during the hour and a half that we were sitting there talking that I'd seen him in like 60 episodes of Psych as young Sean.
That's actually pretty impressive. I mean, now that you mention it, I have also seen Psych.
Yeah.
Not to the level that you have, admittedly. I don't think I'm quite that deep. Sometimes I can say 60 episodes. But until you said that, I hadn't even thought about him being in that.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a testament to how well he's playing that character.
And I'll share a clip from the New York Comic Con red carpet where Luke Tenney, who plays Willie, had a similar reaction, and Luke is a big fan as well of Psych, and had no idea until about halfway through the first day. Liam told him, and he's like, "That was you! I grew up watching you."
Oh wow, well, I don't feel so bad.
So yeah, no, not at all. And yeah, that was a good thing about the pilot, was that they did a really good job of kind of putting all of the pieces in place on the board. In both my review and then in our private conversations, we talked about there are people who are addressed differently in the TV show than they are in the first couple of issues of the comic. But mostly it's in ways that are going to serve the show long term. There are certain characters who weren't really presented in the first couple of issues of the comic, but became huge players later. And so those people got at least brief kind of appearances in the pilot to set them up so they don't seem like they came out of nowhere later.
Absolutely. And like you're saying, that it's setting things up later. And some of the other changes, little tweaks here and there, really did make the story flow a little bit better. I'm not saying that the books did not, but the way they kind of introduced the story and start bringing in those characters and setting pieces up on this, on the game board, so to speak, really actually did something that I didn't really expect the pilot to do as well as it did. And it's like I told you in one of our side conversations, it literally looked, even though there were differences, it was like someone said, let's bring this book to life, and poof, there it was, a living, breathing thing.
Yeah.
It really does jump right off page and onto your screen in a very real way without being a hard and fast clone.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk to Wes and see to what extent he used photo references, because I feel like a chunk of this is probably that he used photo references for things that actually exist, and so then you could create like wardrobe that's almost a dead-on match, or you could buy wardrobe that's a dead-on match. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And little things like that would totally make sense. Otherwise, if that's not the case, then the wardrobe people deserve a ton of credit for kind of reproducing the comic art in a way that feels authentically dated. Because I will say, because of how kind of slick Wes's art is, it very much feels like the 80s but a lot of that is like the weight of the clothes and the cut of the clothes and like the technology and things like that. A lot of the time you can kind of look at characters and not necessarily because of the kind of simple iconic ways that he draws faces and hair and stuff. It doesn't look immediately like, it's not Stranger Things where everybody has like the bangs and the waves. And so it's funny because at a time when I think some people will dismiss this for the first little bit because, like, oh, more 80s nostalgia, boo. Uh, yeah, it takes place in the 80s, but that it doesn't really revel in the 80s, that something in the way that something like it does.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel like I mean, it's the 80s, you know it's the 80s, but it doesn't feel that way. And I think part of it is that everything is put together in a way where it's not let's beat you over the head with nostalgia,
Yeah.
but it's also the things it chooses and selectively kind of weights here and there has so much relevance with more contemporary things.
Mhm.
And speaking to like the details, both in the book, because even the book doesn't hit you over the head with the 80s as hard as it
Yeah.
is.
No, not at
Um,
all.
but I've got to say, I have to give a shout out to whoever is doing Maria's makeup.
Oh yeah.
Like, not only are we talking about her full on, her whole look, but even just her normal I'm not wearing full face look.
Yeah.
It was so incredible and so well detailed that like it actually took me a second to like convince my brain, no, that's really makeup. That's not somebody put a mask. That's not. I mean, it was so
Yeah.
beautifully done.
Well,
And that's one of the things reading the comics, I wondered how that would translate, and it
yeah.
just phenomenal.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really works about the pilot is, to a large extent, the characters in the comics are archetypes.
Mm.
And the difficulty with archetypes is that they can become stereotypes if you're not careful. And I think that the comic does a pretty good job of not having that happen. But in TV, because everything has to be kind of dumbed down a little bit for a broader audience, you really run the risk of that. And so far from what we've seen in the pilot, they've managed to not kind of fall into the tropes of like the Yakuza princess and the cartel,
Hmm.
like it's all like you still maintain the individuality of the characters. It doesn't feel like, oh yeah, this is this character, this is this. So I felt like that was a concern that I had with Maria's look, because had it not been as kind of well done as it was, it could have felt like, really, she's in Day of the Dead makeup. Awesome,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. I think that with that particular one, without spoiling anything, there's a particular scene that I wondered if would make it to to the episode, and it
Hmm.
does. And I remember thinking this can go either really well or this is going to be so cardboard
Yeah.
that it's going to just completely lose the interest in that character. Which, if you've read the comics, Maria is, a very interesting character.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talked about when I talked to them in New York is the fact that almost everybody in this comic is trying to manipulate almost everybody else. Really, you have Marcus, who is essentially what you see on the tin,
Yeah.
and everybody else is to varying degrees trying to play everyone around them. And probably outside of Shabnam, um, the most effective player of people around her is Maria in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah. And I have to say, the actress really does a good job of making it where you know that, but she does it in such a way that it feels natural.
Yeah,
And that's a hard that's if any, in any characters they should be writing or actually portraying something. That's a hard thing to get right.
yeah. And it's really interesting because a lot of the things, it's funny because we keep saying like, oh, I was worried this wouldn't work, I was worried this wouldn't work. It's not because it doesn't work in the comics, it's because comics and TV are two different mediums, and they have different needs and different tropes and different everything. And so there's a lot of things that you see them in the comics and you're like, yeah, this works totally well in a comic book, but like, how's it going to translate?
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about this kind of stuff, a lot of it boils down to like, there are moments in the comics where you're like, this totally works because it's comics and I'm reading between the gutters and I have context and I have, uh, the actors have to put a lot more kind of didactic stuff into it to really tell you like, this is what we're doing, this is what you're looking at, and sell it with their performance, because there's not beats in between in between the moments for you to process your own take on it.
And in television or any visual movie type media, you also don't have the luxury of having the entire spread open in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're only seeing, in a very real way, comic books is literally like comic book television, comic book movies is literally like seeing one panel at a time,
Mm-hmm.
in front of you, as opposed to that big spread, especially when there are large action sequences.
Yeah.
Which is, one of the scenes that I was wondering how would translate.
Yeah. One of the things that's really fun, actually, watching this pilot is knowing that there's a scene where Billy decks a guy with his skateboard during the kind of escape scene.
Mm-hmm.
And on set, they were talking about they have like the two real skateboard decks that he uses, and then there's like stunt decks. So there's one that looks exactly perfect, but it's rubber. And so whenever he's hitting somebody with the skateboard and he's using it as a weapon, it's always like a rubber deck. So that both people, stunt performers don't get hurt, and also so that the skateboard doesn't get broken and have to be replaced.
I hadn't thought about the not breaking the skateboard element of it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where makes total sense, and especially like I don't know if that was a built skateboard or if it was like a vintage 80s skateboard that they acquired a couple copies of. I assume it was probably built because that's just easier for the purposes of like you can just 3D print another one if you need to.
Right.
But God knows.
I also feel like finding exact duplicates of like a vintage skateboard would be
Yeah.
incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if it was a popular enough skateboard for where people actually used it.
Absolutely.
Like it's not like toys in movies where people keep it in the wrapper because like they never got around to it or because they are keeping it on a shelf for,
Yeah, no, skateboards getting all kinds of crazy and
yeah,
well worn is a sign of pride.
Yeah. But yeah, one of the things, and I think this is where we started, and then we already got off track. But one of the things I really liked is the fact that some of the characters who don't get a ton of screen time, and Billy's a great example. The other people I called out in my review were Lex and Brandy. Because they don't have much time, they really have to kind of own the screen whenever they're in a shot. And I think that the actors who have less screen time in the pilot do a really excellent job of communicating kind of quickly and effectively through simple, iconic kind of actions and lines, kind of who they are, and you get a really good kind of quick shorthand of like, okay, it's this, it's this, it's this.
Brandy in particular made me so uncomfortable.
Oh yeah.
In a particular moment, and yeah, you're right. There's not a lot of screen time there, but what screen time is there, it's sticking with you.
Yeah.
Like I already want to see more of Brandy. I know it's a ways off, but I already.
Yeah. I also want to say too, in terms of you were talking about Maria's makeup. Have you seen what Siobhan Williams actually looks like?
You know what? I don't think I actually have, but I've been marveling at her hair in this. So.
Yeah, well, that's a wig.
I was going to hope so because that really is like big Christian hair right there.
Yeah, and she has like.
I literally just looked Siobhan Williams up to see what she looked like in real life. What a transformation!
Yeah, and so the makeup team on this show does an excellent job. The one thing that they have like they have workarounds for everything. Obviously you have workarounds for Saya's tattoos, so poor Lana has to go in there for like 3 hours before you start shooting and all that, and get all that stuff applied. But the one thing that I didn't even notice when we were on set because I didn't think about it. Everybody was in wardrobe, but then I saw Benjamin Wadsworth at New York Comic Con, and I'm like, oh yeah, he still has the notch in his eyebrow because there's just no way around it. Like he just has to shave a little notch to accommodate the scar that he has in the show. But like it's the one thing that the makeup team isn't doing that he has to actually like do and keep. Well, I guess that and Billy's mohawk.
Yeah, that's something you can't really fake either.
Yeah. Also, by the way, this is a random kind of side thing, but the actor who plays Lex was on a recent episode of Legends of Tomorrow.
Really?
Yeah, he was one of the guys in the band on Dancing Queen.
You're right.
And it's funny because as I was watching this pilot the first time, I kept thinking like, if they ever do a flashback episode where you need a young John Constantine, he'd be perfect because he's such a dead ringer for some of the mannerisms that Matt has in that role.
Mhm.
And then it was like I looked him up. Literally, the two screen credits that he has on IMDb are Deadly Class and Legends. And I was like, wait, what was he on Legends? And then I looked, I was like, oh crap, yeah, that's right.
He has such a good look for that time period too.
Oh
He
yeah,
does.
yeah,
Like the casting of this show is so good.
yeah,
Like I remember reading like just casting information and like I love Benedict Wong. I could not see him as Master Lin.
uh-huh,
Like I had the hardest time wrapping my head around that. And then you see him in action, and I'm like, that's the only person I can now envision as Master Lin. But even the kids themselves they're all so perfectly cast. Like,
yeah. And it's always nice when you get uh, a bunch of folks who you don't know that well, and they're perfectly cast
mhm,
because it's like going in, you don't know what you're looking at. You know, by and large, most people don't have a lot of history with almost any of these actors.
yeah,
Um, you know, and even when you do, like the fact that so many people don't recognize Liam from Psych, it's like, oh, that's what happens when you're a child actor and then you actually, you know, go to school.
mhm,
So yeah, I remember looking at the cast list and being like, oh, cool. Most of them look the part, but like I have no idea what to expect because I've never heard of most of these people.
seriously.
And so that tends to me to be a credit, almost more of a credit to the casting directors than when you're able to kind of pull together a dream cast. Uh,
Yeah, it's not easy to get that right straight out of the gate, and
yeah,
they've nailed it. And even Henry Rollins,
yeah,
like not I and probably I think I just blanked that out in my mind that he was going to be there. And so when he appeared on screen, I audibly gasped. And then it was just such a good fit.
it was great. He first of all he got a standing ovation, or not a standing ovation. He got an ovation at the screening at New York Comic Con. Like he appeared on screen and everybody freaked out. But secondly, there's actually a really great interview. I think the podcast is called Mirror Image.
Mm-hmm.
Image Comics just launched a new podcast that is creators talking to other creators, and like usually it's not comic book people talking to comic book people. It's like comic book people talking to actors or painters or musicians or whatever. And it's like everybody's having a dialogue about like what inspires them about the other person's work. And the first episode was Rick Remender talking to Henry Rollins, and the idea that, you know, when he pitched Henry Rollins on coming into Deadly Class, that it was really intimidating because Rollins was like his hero.
Oh, wow.
And so it was one of those, you know, obviously there's a character who doesn't exist in the comics who was created for the show and created for Henry Rollins. And you can listen to a really nice interview between Remender and Rollins kind of interviewing one another that you can track down on the Image Comics website, or I'm sure Remender probably still has it as a pinned tweet or something, because I feel like if I were him, I wouldn't take that down for months.
But that's what moms would call a fridger.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
What in terms of and just kind of to bracket that because it is a character that's created for the show. What I mean by perfect fit is it's literally seamlessly slid right in. Like
Oh yeah,
adaptations, you could say, oh, that's a character that's the original. There's
yeah,
something about it that's a little totally different. Not
yeah,
always the case.
yeah. And I think that the changes made to the school are good because you know, one of the things that Rick said when we were on set is that they're going to be able to kind of go deeper into some things, and they're going to be able to explore kind of moments between things, because obviously when you're doing a comic, and especially when you're doing a comic that is not publishing on a monthly basis, because you know it's the realities of most Image books is that they can't afford to focus exclusively on that book.
Right.
So when you're doing a book that's not publishing on a monthly basis, you can't really, unless you're The Walking Dead, you can't spend a whole lot of time just kind of like exploring 3 months where nothing happens
Right.
and doing like quiet character stuff. And so, the impression I get is they're going to be able to do a lot more with that in the show. And so probably this is not a thing where like you're going to get to, the end of number 18 and the giant like holy crap moment of all of that in the first season. Like I imagine that's going to be like season 3 if it happens,
Yeah.
But
I mean, and I think the pacing even in the pilot already kind of bears that out a little.
Yeah.
There's so much more there. So much more depth that now that I've seen the pilot, I'm actually going to go back and reread the first issue.
Yeah.
Because I feel like having seen the pilot, it's going to actually be more kind of inform my reading.
Yeah.
Of the book even more, and vice versa. But definitely, there's the value of not having to be so economic with.
Yeah. Which is funny because usually it's the opposite. Usually it's like when you're doing another media adaptation, you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour. And so you have to be more economical. But the nature of a show like this is you have 30 issues of a comic and you want a show that theoretically can go for 100 episodes. And so you get to do stuff that you didn't do already.
And I imagine that, Remender's probably got like a bucket of ideas.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every writer and every artist has a bucket of ideas for whatever their project is.
Yeah.
It never makes it to page, or never makes it out of the bucket. And if they have the opportunity to devote the time, the space, and the money to do so, they're going to dip right back into it.
Yeah.
I strongly get the impression that we're going to get to see some of that, and I'm really excited for it.
I mean, one thing is this May, when Free Comic Book Day rolls around, there's going to be a Free Comic Book Day one-shot that's a new Deadly Class story set in the comics past, which is probably the future of the TV show. But there are a handful of characters who are dead in the comics, but alive on the TV show, who are pictured on the cover of that one-shot. Mm-hmm. And so... like just that alone, it's like, okay, so you're literally creating a story now for the comics that you can then adapt on the TV show if you want to, because you've essentially inserted a moment into the past. Mm-hmm. But the other change that I really liked at the school is Wong, and you kind of talked about how it was hard to see necessarily Lin, excuse me. It was hard to see Benedict Wong kind of in the role at first, but I do like the fact that they've changed him from kind of this scrawny kind of ancient Mr. Miyagi type into somebody who has a little bit more of a physical presence to him. I do think the couple of times that we see him kind of in action in the comics, it tends to be really effective because you see him and he looks like he's got that Bugs Bunny thing where he's all just like tendons and hair. And so, it's like the joke in Fight Club. Abe Lincoln would win the fight because skinny guys fight till they're burger. But I think that for a live action adaptation, first of all, you want somebody with more physical presence. And second of all, if you want the show to go more than 5 years, you don't necessarily want to hire somebody who looks like they're 100 years old.
I also think that, and this is not necessarily a critique of the comic, because I think the comic did a very good job, and I think there's some value to having Lin be that older character. But there's also a little bit of a stereotype of the ancient Asian man who's, wise and lovely, and that is such a stereotype and it's such a deeply entrenched trope that I think that it's a real benefit that they make him younger, more physically present, a little less like you're going to go have, tea and wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think part of that was, I think it's a wink and a nod to the 80s. I think that it literally, like, I see Pat Morita in Lin a little bit. And I think it really is like an overt kind of like, he's Mr. Miyagi.
Miyagi, though not really evil, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. He's the Mr. Miyagi who you would not want to be taking lessons from. No. But I think that in the context of the TV show, they leaned away from some of that stuff because they have other ways of signifying the 80s stuff,
Yeah.
The world is more immersive. The colors are more immersive. There are things that film does differently than comics, and so I think certain things from the comics that are there in part just to be like, hey guys, it's the '80s. Remember, uh, like they don't have to be there because when you're going through the set, there's VHS tapes on a bunch of shelves.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think something else the show does, well, speaking in terms of like setting references to the '80s, I think a trap that a lot of shows fall into, and I'm going to call Stranger Things out just a little bit for this. Not that I am super deeply into Stranger Things, but just generally, a lot of times when a show does try to go back into a specific place in time, be it the '80s, be it the '90s, they literally saturate it with that time period. And if you think about how people live through any span of time, no one's house is all 1987.
Yeah,
No
yeah,
one's neighborhood is all 1993. You're going to get influences of like in 1970, you still had influences of like the late 70s. You were still seeing things from 1984 and different places, and that's something that they do a really good job of
yeah,
in terms of giving you references not just to the specific point in time, but what that would have looked like just generally. Like I think that's and I think that's another kind of a change, not from the comics necessarily, but just from what you would expect.
yeah. And I think part of that, honestly, and I didn't talk to them about this on set, but I have to assume because they shoot this in Vancouver and they're shooting Vancouver for San Francisco. And so I kind of feel like some of the kind of verisimilitude had to be them taking photos of San Francisco 1987 and going, we need to replicate as much as we can, as exactly as we can, because Vancouver ultimately does not look like San Francisco 8 months out of the year.
Not even close. And that might actually be the one complaint that I had. That is the one thing that I was noticeable enough for me that I kind of actually wrote it down. Whenever I watch the pilot for the first time, I always take notes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm someone who's lived in San Francisco, and that might be part of the issue for me. But I remember there are a couple scenes where my thought was, I'm like, man, this is too flat to be San Francisco.
Yeah.
Like there's no way this would happen. Like this is not. But at the same time, they do get a lot of the city's tonal references correct.
Yeah.
They do a very good job in a lot of places of making Vancouver look and feel more from a distance and from up close, like San Francisco. Even
Yeah.
to this day, because there are some pockets of San Francisco proper that do still have a really strong '80s vibe to them.
Yeah. Well, and it helps too. I mean, there's a handful of things that help. It helps that both Vancouver and San Francisco have a really vibrant Chinatown. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll be able to see elements of that incorporated into future episodes. It also helps that, there's the famous Mark Twain quote about the coldest winter you've ever spent is a summer in San Francisco. And so you will get like the fog and the weather conditions. When you think of California and you think of Vancouver, usually they don't match up at all, and that was a problem they had on shows like Psych sometimes, where it's like, this doesn't look like Southern California. San Francisco, it'll be less of an issue.
Yeah, Vancouver and San Francisco have very similar climates.
Yeah,
because you will freeze your butt off in San Francisco more often than not.
But I think that they also have to be super aware of these things. Like I can't imagine that part of the success is not just coming from like going in knowing we have this and this obstacle. What do we do? And like getting answers hammered out before cameras start rolling. And they do shoot a lot of stuff on a set. There's the nice thing about Sci-Fi is they seem to be trying to go the way of AMC, trying to make themselves not just the Sharknado guys. And so you see them spending a lot of money on a lot of things that look really good. I think that I love Wynonna Earp. The first season felt a lot campier, and as the show has aged, it's like the look of the show has improved.
Yes.
And during that time, you started seeing them introducing things like The Expanse and Krypton and things like that. Or not The Expanse. What was the other one?
Oh gosh. This is how you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fair. Full disclosure, it's 2:00 in the morning for me and 1:00 for you. So it's Anyway, but you're starting to see sci-fi not being quote unquote the sci-fi channel anymore, and
it is definitely and you know have one of my variety of professional backgrounds is in makeup artistry, which is partially why I had to say something about Maria's makeup. But,
yeah,
there's a term called glow up where you get better, like you look better. You've figured out how to improve everything, and sci-fi is definitely undergoing that. And I think that Deadly Class is just another great sign of how it really has. And even Van Helsing has also dramatically improved its look from season 1 to
yeah, absolutely.
There's some huge leaps there, and just based off of the quality, I mean, just the quality of the pilot of Deadly Class. And again, we don't know what future episodes are going to look like. It definitely sets there's a very strong foundation there going into it, but they're setting themselves up to very possibly have the next quote unquote Walking Dead in terms of something that is well put together, an excellent, well told story that's got familiarity from comics, but also these additional elements as well to tell something really dynamic and culturally impactful. I mean, we can't disregard the elements of Deadly Class's story that makes so much sense even contemporarily. I mean, it's not a secret in the comics. Marcus blamed Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Because of cutting funding for mental health, and that's still a real life issue that people are dealing with still to this day. And so I think that between the story having this universal quality to it that kind of jumps timelines to a certain extent, and also just really well done quality and this excellent foundation, this show really is, like you said, one of the best comic book pilots I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it and it's like, first of all, pilots are really hard to do. Some of the best shows you've ever seen have kind of mediocre pilots. But I look at it and it's like I put it right up there with The Flash and Riverdale and iZombie, and it's weird. I don't want to say all CW stuff, but really outside of the Marvel Netflix stuff, it's mostly the CW who have really good comic pilots. There's a lot of good comic show. Like you look at a show like Gotham or a show like Agents of Shield, and those are good shows, but they were good shows halfway through season 2.
Oh yeah, they're pilots, and even most of their first seasons. Agents of Shield almost completely lost me as a viewer in the first.
Yeah, and so that's part of like the discussion of Deadly Class having such a great pilot. Even Krypton, I thought the pilot was very, very strong, but I was mostly sold on what we knew about the show going in and the fact that the pilot set it up so effectively. It's like the pilot was very good, but I wouldn't say the pilot was great. It was like it was a very good pilot that was setting them up for a great season. And Wynonna, I've said this before, as much as I adore that show now, I think I had to watch the pilot 2 or 3 times before I finally kind of clicked with it and was like, oh, okay, yes, this is the show I want. It was a thing where I kind of sat with it a few times, and it didn't quite work for me for whatever reason at first. So a pilot is really hard to do, and when you look at kind of the great comics pilots, Smallville again is one of those that it's funny. You can look back at that show. It's been, God, almost 20 years, I guess, since that show started. Yeah. And I know that recently somebody did a list, and it was like, the 10 best episodes or whatever. And the pilot is still number 1. Mm-hmm. and so that tells you something about like how hard it is to do a truly great pilot and how important it is to do a really strong pilot, because in a show that lasts for 10 years, if your best episode is the pilot, but people still think fondly of you and don't sit there and bitch that you got worse as you went on, yeah. It means you've done something right.
And we can definitely all think of, even within the comic book genre, shows that had a great beginning and you reach a point where you're like, please just cancel this.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of some particular shows right now.
Yeah.
That do that. And I think that if Deadly Class delivers on this pilot beyond, we get 3-4 episodes in and we're still seeing this kind of quality, mm-hmm. There's a very real possibility that they're going to have one hell of a show.
Oh yeah, and I think too the really interesting thing will be how people react to it. the comic, it's easy to make comparisons to The Walking Dead in the comic because they're both from Image. They both kind of truck in this thing where anybody can just die at any time because it's a very violent world and there's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens. And in the post Game of Thrones, post Walking Dead world, I think that there's going to be a lot of kind of that in terms of like the audience going like, holy crap, the biggest thing I'm waiting for is for, you know, this plot point where so-and-so dies. But I think that the thing that's interesting about Deadly Class is Sci-Fi doesn't have a show like that where people are hanging on that kind of stuff. Like even Winona, which people adore, it's mostly about kind of character moments. It's not about plot. And like Krypton, it's like it's a blend of both. I don't think anybody's like hanging on every moment of it, even if like they had that great Zod twist in the first season and things like that. It's not a plotty show. It's much more character driven. And this is a character driven show, but plot is such a big part of what makes the comic work. That I think this could be it could be a unique thing to Sci-Fi, and it could be potentially their version of, you know, The Walking Dead. It could be their thing of people getting really, really invested in a way that they haven't necessarily seen before. And we'll see, because obviously it's hard to predict. Like you couldn't have predicted that AMC was going to undergo a radical sea change as a result of The Walking Dead. Anybody who says that they knew it is lying.
Yeah, no one saw that coming.
So like you're not sitting here going like, oh yeah, this is going to be The Walking Dead and Sci-Fi is going to be a contender in 2 years. Like that's not a reasonable prediction to make. But I do think that the way the audience engages with Deadly Class could be very similar to the way the audience engages with The Walking Dead. And that could change the way that Sci-Fi approaches some of their products in the future if it is as good as it kind of promises to be.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to change a little bit of how some of these stories are told too.
Yeah.
Like you said, this has definitely got both elements of the characters and the plot, and you don't always see that done with a good set of balance. I think if this is done right, we could see, partially because of Deadly Class, not just a shift on Sci-Fi, but a kind of a shift in the way stories are being told on other networks too. I mean, it's entertainment industry. When somebody finds something that really, really works, everyone does some kind of version of it, or you know, a version within like their own. You know, maybe it's not zombies, maybe it's something else.
Yeah.
I think that Deadly Class is kind of in a unique position that it's coming in that growth phase with a kind of its own unique story, where it may be actually changing how we see future stories being told, or different comics that have been maybe hiding back there that are adaptations going forward.
And it's also coming at a moment where it shares DNA with a lot of things that are on TV right now. You know, when we were joking when we did the set visit, it was part of a kind of larger group of set visits, and we went to Sabrina and Deadly Class and The Magicians, and that same week I went to Legacies, and it was like, oh, I'm going to another special school for special people who do special things. And it just felt like this is a thing that we're tapping into right now. Post Riverdale, I think, is all of these kind of like cool little niche, you know, stories about special young people who are trapped in situations over their heads. And meanwhile, you see Deadly Class like not only fits into that, but then it also is kind of the tip of the spear for this wave of comics adaptations that are coming in the next year or so, where you're going to see The Boys and you're going to see Y the Last Man, and you're going to see, you know, various different things that are Umbrella Academy. You're going to see non-superhero comic adaptations that are in a lot of ways kind of these offbeat, stylish, violent kind of things that you wouldn't necessarily know they were comics, except for the fact that like that's how they're being kind of entreed into the world because there's a million comic book adaptations. And so it's this weird thing where it checks a lot of boxes of things that are going on. And so in the same way that you kind of said, like, yeah, if this gets popular, you could see a lot of copycats. It's almost like it's built in that even if the show doesn't become a standard bearer itself, it's an effective execution of a couple of things that like are already kind of really hot right now. And so it's interesting to see kind of I feel like it's coming into the TV ecosphere at a moment where we're really ready for it. And it'll be really interesting to see kind of how the audience responds. I'm excited to see kind of what the chatter is on Twitter tomorrow as more and more people actually get a chance to sit down with it. Because obviously the people who've seen it at these handful of special screenings they've done and the press people who have seen it up to this point are all kind of predisposed to liking it, because the people who are watching it a month early are the people who really want to see it. And so now that it's out there on the internet for people to watch for free, I'm really curious to see how the audience starts to respond.
I'm also kind of curious to see how people who literally have no experience in subject matter see it.
Yeah.
And that's, that's even beyond just the people who aren't like the super niche, super interested. I mean, because obviously you're going to get a wave of people watching the pilot online who have read the comic or at least heard of the comics. And then you're possibly going to start getting people who are complete, total, I have no idea what this is, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
And I think that in a very real way that Deadly Class is striking at exactly the right time. And I'm not saying there's necessarily superhero fatigue. I don't necessarily see that. I think that we're getting new stories and different ways of telling stories. But I think this is definitely seeing a shift in kind of the type of entertainment we're willing to accept from comic books, and in a very real way is elevating the entire medium.
Yeah. And again, I mean, we're at a point where we've got iZombie, we've got Wynonna Earp, we have even Krypton to an extent, although that's still, ostensibly superheroes. We're at a moment in time right now where I think people are much more willing to go like, okay, like let's try to step outside of the box of superheroes, because even traditionally, even stories that weren't quote unquote superhero stories were very rooted in superheroism. I mean, you look at a thing like Smallville, where nominally it was about Clark, but it became about Superman very quickly. And so I think that you're right. It's coming along at a time when the definition of kind of what a comics adaptation can be is expanding. It's going to be really interesting to see how people respond to this kind of wave this year of, like I said, a bunch of stuff that doesn't conform to how you think of a comic book adaptation. And it'll be interesting to see whether people watch, Deadly Class and Watchmen and Umbrella Academy and even make necessarily connections back to the comics, or whether most of the audience will be there for the show and the comics will be kind of an afterthought, like you see with The Walking Dead.
I'm actually kind of curious to see if, in any way, if Deadly Class kind of drives people to some of the shows you mentioned. Like you specifically mentioned The Magicians.
Mm-hmm.
I am a huge fan of The Magicians. I adore that show. It's probably one of my top 10 all-time favorites for a lot of reasons. And one of the things, I mean, I don't think it gets quite the, I mean, obviously it has its audience. It's been continuously renewed.
Yeah.
But I don't think it makes quite the dent that other shows might make. And I'm kind of wondering to see if the success of something that maybe, and I'm loath to use the term mainstream because I don't necessarily see Deadly Class as mainstream in the standard sense. But I'm kind of wanting to see if something that maybe is a little more quote-unquote mainstream like Deadly Class, really hitting that sweet spot, striking right when that iron is hot like it is right now, if that's going to kind of maybe shift people a little bit to maybe give shows like Wynonna Earp, The Magicians, and even Krypton, because it is very much not a standard superhero story.
Yeah.
Second look, because they don't necessarily get some of the buzz that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and The Flash and Arrow and things like that. I'd be curious to see if there's also kind of like a side effect of bolstering some of these other shows.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I certainly think that you're starting to see a wave of kind of stylish comic book shows, and Happy we haven't mentioned, but Happy's a hit as well on Sci-Fi. And I kind of feel like soon you're going to see a world where Sci-Fi has potentially as many comic book shows as the CW, but because they're not a shared universe and they aren't superhero shows, they aren't thought of in that way. Like, you don't have people going, oh, well, Sci-Fi is going to ruin their reputation if they're nothing but comic book shows, like you do with people at the CW every year.
Right.
And so it'll be really interesting to see as they build this. And also Sci-Fi, because of the fact that they aren't a major network, they have an extra hour of programming open relative to other networks, because the 10 o'clock hour, which is when Deadly Class is airing, it's when Krypton airs, is open to them in a way that it isn't to the CW, because the CW has essentially to stick with like prime time, because they need to have 1 million people watching for a show to be a hit. And so there's a lot of kind of moving pieces, but I feel like as you start to get some of these shows bundled, like I do think that, you know, Deadly Class can drive people to The Magicians of Krypton if you pair it correctly and you market it correctly. And it'll be interesting to see as they start to build a brand identity that isn't just kind of tee-hee Sharknado, that it'll be interesting to see how these things kind of support one another. You know, I think we've seen that already with Wynonna, because Wynonna, at least in the public consciousness, has gotten bigger and bigger as it's gone on. And that's not what you usually see in television. Usually it's like the most interest is the first season and there's standard attrition. You know, everybody comes in, they're super excited to see it, and then eventually they drop off. With Wynonna, it's getting bigger and more talked about every year. And I kind of feel like what you're going to start to see is that the credibility of Wynonna and Krypton and the Magicians and whatever else is going to help Sci-Fi shed some of the baggage of its image. And you could very realistically see, and like I said, I don't think you're ever going to see something like The Walking Dead revolutionizing AMC again. But I do think if you get a bunch of these shows that are all good in the same space and that all have similar audiences, you know, I could easily see them doubling the audience of something like Wynonna Earp and making it, you know, close to like Supergirl and The Flash.
Absolutely.
All right.
The winners of the audience.
Yeah.
Great programming.
All right. Any final thoughts? We talked for an awful long time, and this is a lot of kind of broad generalizations because we didn't want to get into super spoiler territory. We will kind of do more of an episodic breakdown when once people have had a little bit more time to digest the episode and we have our other co-hosts with us. Mm-hmm. But any final thoughts before we shut down for the evening?
My only final thoughts is if you've seen the pilot, you know, talk about it on social media. I want to see what people are saying. Like,
yeah,
I really want to be involved in that conversation because I'm dying to see what people think of this. And that's really my only final thought is I really want to hear what other people think.
Yeah, the one thing I will say to me, and I said this in my interview, the part that grabbed me the least was the first like 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so, because it felt very much like something you'd seen before. Like it wasn't bad, but it was like, oh, we're doing this now. And if you're, I feel like if you're watching it online instead of at like TV time, it's easier to kind of just walk away from it. And I would say if you're starting the episode, if for some reason you've listened to this first, I don't know why you would, but if you're having trouble kind of getting into the episode in the first 10 minutes or so, like stick it out, because basically as much as I like Benjamin Wadsworth, there's only so much you can do when it's one character kind of feeling sorry for himself. But once the other characters start to enter the show and the world starts to flesh out, it is when it really comes alive. And so if you're sitting down to watch the pilot and you're having a hard time kind of making it through those first 15 minutes or so, just know that like that exposition has to be there so that some of the decisions he makes later make sense. But that once the other characters come in, it catches fire.
There's definitely a payoff for that.
Yeah. 100%. All right. So where can people find you on the wide world of webs?
Well, they can find me on Twitter at Life in Polaroid. And I will say this for clarity, it is spelled just like the camera.
Nice. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Russ Burlingame, RussBurlingame. That's really long, and I'm not going to repeat it. So you can follow Deadly Class Pod, and once we have announced our lineup of hosts, all of our usernames will be in the bio. You can subscribe to the show on Podbean right now. Once we have a few episodes in the bank, I'll get us up on Spotify and iTunes. And you can follow us at deadlyclasspodcast.com. And yeah, check back with us in the next week or so, because like I said, not only are we going to have a much more kind of content-heavy discussion of the pilot, but also very soon we're going to start talking about the comics. And our first episode will probably be a little bit more introductory in terms of like how we all came to Deadly Class and why we're doing the podcast. So my other show, the Emerald City Video Podcast, I always say, you know, come back by noon on the 5th day, and always remember to rewind your cassettes. That seems like a little bit. Seems like I can appropriately say that for this time, because probably it'll be about 5 days, and we'll have something more and something deeper. And also, you know, Deadly Class takes place in 1987, so rewind those cassettes.
Be kind, rewind.
Exactly.